A couple weeks ahead of this year's Pokemon Day Presents, it was being rumored that FireRed and LeafGreen would be getting a re-release on the Switch family of consoles. With the cat seemingly now out of the bag, Pokemon themselves would soon after confirm the news, announcing that the pair of games would indeed be getting a re-release following the Presents on February 27th. And I gotta say, as someone who had never played these games beyond their opening hours, this news had me very excited. And so, come the 27th, I went ahead and picked up both versions, one for my Switch and one for my Switch 2. Something I've actually never done before, which kind of goes to show how keen I was to play these games. And with me being so eager to play these, why not also make a video so I can talk about them? Since this year is Pokemon's 30th anniversary, I was gonna get into that in my eventual Legends ZA review, but with me making this video too, guess I can now tackle that discussion from two different fronts. One where I approach it through the series' newest mainline entry, and one through the series' first ever remakes. Share what I thought about them after this first full playthrough I was able to do, and how I feel about their place in the series, now over 20 years after their original release. But with me now making a video on these games, it would be impossible for me to do so without first sharing some tragic lore about me involving them. Because as I've been implying, I have already played these games before, but never to completion, leading to them occupying a bit of a weird place for me prior to this Switch re-release, and in turn, kind of being the reason why this re-release was something I was hoping to see at some point. So to give you the condensed version of this story, back during middle school, around 2012 give or take a year, I would end up trading away a copy of Pokemon Emerald that had been previously gifted to me for one of these bootleg GBA cartridges that was like 100 games in one. I had already played through Emerald enough by that point. Sure, why not give up this copy for all these other games? That seems like a good deal to me. Especially since among those many games are none other than FireRed and LeafGreen, which I had never played before. And I know, this already hurts to listen to, but it gets worse. I would start up a playthrough of FireRed, where I made it maybe up until Vermilion or even Celadon City, before coming back to my save one day and seeing that it had been completely wiped. Not really understanding why, I would restart the game a few more times, even trying out LeafGreen if maybe that worked. But no matter what I did, my progress would no longer save. I would come to realize that if I wanted to beat the game, I had to keep my console on. And this part I do distinctly remember, as I did keep my DS on for a couple days, playing through the game one more time, but with me fearing that this would damage my console, I would give up on this endeavor, ultimately throwing away that stupid cartridge, accepting it as the broken piece of crap that I had received in exchange for what was literally a gem of a game. I may have been a straight A student back then, but clearly I wasn't immune to still making some stupid decisions. But this little ordeal would indeed be my sole experience with these games up until this re-release. For whatever reason, I just never bothered to pick up a legit cartridge of these games back when they weren't so expensive. And as I went over in my previous video on Silent Hill F, it's only been as of late that I have messed around with emulation, a topic that I do have a couple more thoughts on, where I'll bring them up at the end of the video. Luckily for me though, Pokemon would come through and provide me with this new official way to play these games, where now I can conclude this playthrough that in a way has been roughly 14 years in the making. And with it being so long, I won't delay this any further. So let's get into what I thought about these games now that I have finally played through them. Perhaps the biggest thing on my mind when playing FireRed and LeafGreen for this video was thinking about just how much simpler things were back then. The series has progressed so much since its GBA days, adding so many more Pokemon, features, things to do, the stories and characters have so much more going on, and with these being Gen 1 remakes specifically, it feels so quaint having this back to basics experience. And in some ways, this did have me brainstorming about how certain things here could have benefited from being expanded on if this were a more modern game, but in other ways, I do appreciate the simplicity behind the Kanto experience, with the story here being a perfect example of that. Just a straightforward adventure of catching and battling cool monsters, and if that wasn't enough of a motive to keep playing, then you have the objectives of taking down Team Rocket and becoming champion. The plot of the Kanto games may not be as complex as those of future entries, or even reach the great heights of, say, Black and White or Sun and Moon, but I still like the story they tell, as it frankly lacks the poorly handled elements that certain future entries would go on to have. I think back to my playthrough of Sword, that in a way also felt very back to basics. This was due to the gym battling aspect of those games, something reintroduced after Sun and Moon ditched the concept. And with them bringing the series staple back, they did so in such a bombastic way that I couldn't help but get pumped up about each new gym battle. Them taking place in these large stadiums, having this awesome hype music playing, gym leader matches had never felt so exciting. And for that reason, I was vibing with the game, even if it did have other things that I didn't care all that much about or didn't like. So, when it came time to face Leon, the ultimate culmination of this league challenge I was really invested in, I was so annoyed that it then got interrupted by Rose and his dumbass plan with Eternatus, which honestly just ruined the game's story for me. FireRed and LeafGreen doesn't have any of that, where I'm scratching my head at what the villain is doing. Sure, Rose may have more interesting motives than Giovanni and the rest of Team Rocket, but at least their actions make a consistent amount of sense. They just want money and power, with all their actions in the game reflecting that. Stealing Pokemon at Mount Moon to sell back at their casino, taking over places like Cerulean and Saffron City to exert their presence in Kanto, outright killing Pokemon in Lavender Town to show they mean business. The Kanto games do such a clean job of implementing these buffoons all the way to the end. Just when you think you've seen the last of them at Silph Co., you get that one last reveal that Team Rocket's boss Giovanni was the 8th gym leader all along. Not only is this a neat way to intertwine both the gym leader and Team Rocket storylines, it's also a cool way to get the imagination going on how he must have been handling both of these roles. Sure, his ultimate downfall happens with just a few lines of text, but I'd rather take something quaint like this, where I can easily move on, than something like Sword and Shield that tries to be big and epic, but fails at pulling it off, making it feel that much worse of a climax. I think your rival here also fits into what I'm describing. There really isn't much to Blue's character. He's just cocky no matter how many times you beat him, but he's still memorable. You want to put him in his place to prove him wrong, which is enough of an incentive when the story here isn't going for any big arcs or themes. Future games would go on to introduce rivals with more depth to them, but I still consider Blue as one of the best ones for being such a fun character to have around. Something I'd rather take any day than, say, a game having a whole crew of nothing burgers like X and Y. Hell, even the Hoenn games or Sword and Shield could have benefited from cutting down on the amount of rivals they had, since some come out as way more interesting than others. However, where FireRed and LeafGreen really got me enthused about what I was doing was ironically in how not so simple it was in other aspects. I didn't realize until this playthrough just how open-ended Kanto gets upon reaching Lavender Town. Though really the moment where you unlock true freedom is when you get cut at the SS Anne, since technically you don't have to do Lieutenant Surge's gym right after. But at least for me, it was when I reached Lavender Town that it hit me just how many options I had that I didn't know what to do first. I could either grind up a few more levels going south on Route 12, or head west to Celadon City. But then when I'm there, I can either go fight Erica, go to the game corner and buy up half my team, thanks to the Nugget Bridge exploit I did earlier. Maybe stay there and do the rocket hideout, do some shopping at the mall, or head to the Celadon Mansion and grab the tea that unlocks Saffron City. If I do that, then I could also do the fighting dojo there. But let's say I make a beeline to the rocket hideout to get the Sylph Scope as fast as possible. Then go to the Pokemon Tower, obtain the Poke Flute, wake up either Snorlax, arrive at Fuchsia City, then I can go into the Safari Zone, obtain the Surf HM, go beat Koga, and just like that, I now have access to the Seafoam Islands, the Power Plant, Cinnabar Island, and here in FireRed and LeafGreen specifically, if I beat Blaine, then I unlock the first few Sevii Islands. I could potentially do all that before fighting Lieutenant Surge, Erica, Sabrina, and exploring their respective cities or nearby routes. I don't know how I went this long being oblivious to the amount of freedom the Kanto games give you when it comes to exploring the region. With Pokemon going open world, Scarlet and Violet really trying to do that open-ended approach with its progression, it makes me appreciate the Kanto games even more that they're doing this from the very beginning. Stuff like this really aids in the replay value for these games, especially since you can get certain Pokemon way earlier than you might have expected. For example, making a beeline to Cinnabar Island means you can use your chosen fossil Pokemon for a longer portion of your playthrough. I always thought it was weird that you get your fossil so early on, but then can't use it until you're at the penultimate gym, when really, that doesn't have to be the case. Which is a good thing, because the Gen 1 fossils are all among my favorite Gen 1 Pokemon. Speaking of, I need to take a moment to actually praise the Pokédex here. It's funny, the Kantomons get glazed so often due to how much Pokemon panders to Gen 1, something that I do find annoying because it's not like there isn't nostalgia for every other gen, but I still gotta admit that those original 151 are a pretty solid bunch of creatures to start on a franchise with. And I bring this up since I forced myself to run a completely different team from what I used back in Let's Go, which was my last time in Kanto. Back then, I used Pikachu, all 3 starters, Nidoking, and Snorlax, with all those evolutionary lines being among my absolute favorites from Gen 1. But then when it came time to figure out what I would use here, I really didn't have much trouble finding new cool mons to run. Even with me taking out the evolutionary lines I already used, there are still so many more species here I'd consider among my favorites across the entire series. Like, I'm talking within my top 25-30%. This is purely subjective, but when I sit down and take a good, honest look at the Kanto decks, there are very few misses. It might actually be in my top 3 dexes in the series. And with that said, I gotta shout out the squad I ended up putting together for this FireRed playthrough, as it's gotta be one of my all-time favorites. First time using an evolution in any playthrough ever with Flareon, which is my second favorite out of the bunch. Dragonite and Scizor being my second and 6th favorite mons of all time. Kabutops probably in my top 3 favorite fossil Pokemon behind Dragozolt and Anorith. Alakazam, absolute stone cold classic mon right there. Also, I believe only my second time ever using a trade evolution mon, not since my first Pokemon game in Platinum where I used Rhyperior. And of course, Blastoise, since even with the restrictions I gave myself, I'm the type of person who always uses their starter Pokemon no matter what. I absolutely love this squad, and bonus shout out if you appreciate the nicknames I gave them, I think they all fit quite well. However, there was one minor problem with this squad, specifically with a certain member here, that being Scizor, which unlike my Kadabra, who I evolved midway into my journey by trading with myself, had to remain uninvolved as a Scyther for the bulk of my playthrough. Now, being forced to keep around a Scyther isn't all that bad. It's still a really cool Pokemon in its own right, with the exact same base stat total of 500. But it would have been nice to have a Scizor earlier into the playthrough. Unfortunately, the metal coat needed to evolve it isn't available until the post-game, but even if I somehow gave myself access to one before then, the game would have still cock-blocked me and prevented the Scyther from evolving. And that's because FireRed and LeafGreen are extremely anal about not letting you use any non-Gen 1 Pokemon until you get the National Pokédex, requiring at least 60 different species to be caught, completing the quest line with the first 3 Sevii Islands, and becoming champion, thus locking this feature to the post-game. In reading about FireRed and LeafGreen after this re-release was confirmed, I was reminded about this roadblock the game presents you, but I did not realize the full severity of it until starting up my LeafGreen playthrough. I did just go on about how great the Kanto Dex is, but for LeafGreen, I did want to change things up by transferring over some cool Johto Pokemon I had caught in FireRed, only to find out the Larvitar and Heracross I had caught could not be traded over whatsoever, preventing the Gen 1 Pokemon from evolving. That's one thing. But just outright preventing you from using any Gen 2 or Gen 3 Pokemon, that's just lame, bro. Like, come on. Even other Pokemon games that have some infamy tied to their restrictions are, in my opinion, nowhere near as bad. Black and White, unbeknownst to me at the time of its release, got shit for only featuring Gen 5 Pokemon until the post-game. I'm someone who almost always runs new mons with every new gen for their in-game team, so this isn't something that would bother me, but let's say today if I wanted to go back and replay the game with non-Gen 5 Pokemon, Black and White isn't gonna block me from just trading over some Gen 1 through 4 mons. Sword and Shield, which arguably got even more of a pushback, or at least it felt like it since I was seeing that shit every day on Twitter when that was going down, still shipped with 400 Pokemon in the game before DLCs bumped that number up even higher. Not exactly starving for choice there. So now learning that FireRed and LeafGreen, and apparently even Emerald, have these restrictions that no other games have, like, what the fuck, Game Freak? Come on, let me use a fucking T-Tart in my Kanto run. And this right here is in fact my biggest issue with these games. This insistence of having you just use the Gen 1 mons for the bulk of your playthrough was completely unnecessary. Which, by the way, this is nearly identical to one of the problems I bitched about back in my Let's Go video. That game led in the regional forms, but then future evolutions like Crobat, Electivire, Sylveon, none of those were in the game. I don't know what it is with Game Freak and them ignoring all these other future Pokemon when they choose to revisit Kanto. It's really annoying. And again, I like the Gen 1 mons, that's not my problem. It's the game outright saying no that rubs me the wrong way. Give me that freedom to change things up if that's what I want. I get trying to make a faithful remake if that's what you're going for, but I believe there was a very easy way you could have accommodated both the old school crowd of those wanting to relive their Gen 1 experience and those that want to play through Kanto with a wider variety of mons. And to talk about that, I'm gonna have to talk about the most significant addition FireRed and LeafGreen adds to the Kanto experience, the Sevii Islands. More than anything else, getting to check out these islands was what had me so excited to play these remakes. I had always known about them, sometimes mixing them up with the Southern Islands, but that's a TCG thing, but not the Orange Islands, which is of course an anime thing. Lots of islands. But I had never really read up to see what all they added to the Gen 3 Kanto experience. I always wanted to keep that part as a surprise for when I did eventually come back to these games. But now, having gone through these islands, I gotta be honest here and say that I came out of them a little bit disappointed. Which is funny I say this, because I had always considered these as this cool, new worthy addition to the Kanto experience. It's having an actual post-game area versus just one cave. Even when I was done playing through Let's Go, I don't recall if I explicitly brought this up in the video, but I know for a fact I at least had it in mind. I thought that those games should have had some type of bonus endgame area like FireRed and LeafGreen, whether it had been something new or a return to these islands. So what happened here for me to say they didn't live up to my expectations? I'm of the mindset that I'm still glad these islands were added and get to exist as this much needed expansion to Kanto, but Game Freak didn't go far enough with them. And before I elaborate on that and tie it back to what I was complaining about right before this, I can't continue without at least mentioning the parts about them that I did enjoy or don't have anything explicitly negative to say about. Starting from the top, you have Mount Ember being the new dedicated dungeon for Moltres, and the accompanying spa that just takes me back to visiting Lava Ridge Town, which has always been one of my favorite places in the series. There are some new helpful NPCs, like the Move Relearner, one who teaches your starter one of the elemental Hyper Beam variants, another who will give your trainer card stickers, acting as a sort of 100% game completion tracker, and a daycare that allows you to breed Pokemon, as the one just south of Cerulean City is still only limited to one Pokemon. There's Memorial Island, which is this unique, memorable locale acting as a grave spot for this NPC's Pokemon, and there's the Tenobi Ruins, for all you unknown completionists. Though now, thanks to this Switch re-release, the two previously event-exclusive islands can also be easily accessed upon beating the game, those being Naval Rock and Birth Island, allowing the capture of Ho-Oh, Lugia, and Deoxys. I don't think I need to say anything else about how cool those additions are. And if that wasn't sweet enough, none of these mons are shiny locked, which means that you absolute freaks out there have free reign to go ahead and soft reset in front of them thousands of times for that one dopamine hit. So all of these additions are well and good, but then we have the other parts here that I wish had a bit more going on. There's a second game corner here on 2 Island offering 2 mini games, though both are multiplayer only. I get this was likely done to promote use of the wireless adapter originally bundled with the game, but come on, I would have 100% killed some time here like I did back in the first game corner if there was a single player option. Instead, now, I'm just gonna play it once for this video as I presumably have an awkward time playing on my 2 Switches simultaneously. The trainer tower at the very end of 7 Island, similar situation. I was ready to go check it out, but then looking up what you even do here and what you get, I just lost my motivation right then and there. You see me playing it for the video, but otherwise I felt perfectly content skipping out on it. Unlike future battle facilities, the rewards here are pretty minimal, and the battles themselves are about speedrunning them as opposed to keeping up a streak. This will definitely appeal to some people, and hey, more power to you if you're a fan of it, but for me, it just seems so bare bones to what other battle facilities would go on to offer. I'm glad Game Freak would go on to step up their game and create the Battle Frontier in Emerald right after this. The Team Rocket element of the post-game is something else in the same vein that feels pretty thrown together. It does act as a bridge to the events of Gold, Silver, and Crystal, with Team Rocket trying to contact Giovanni, but you could have had a bit more with this plotline. I did say earlier I like the simple plot of the Kanto games, but when you have your rival showing up here and there in these islands and not really doing anything, and even Lorelei making a one-off appearance, I can't help but think you could have at least had a more exciting series of events incorporating these elements. On the Lorelei thing, I do like that they expanded just a bit on this one character with this extra added lore that she's from the Sevii Islands and also has an ever-growing plush collection. She's just like me for real. But I was expecting her to make more appearances after the 2 of us fight off Team Rocket. I don't really know what exactly they could have done, but that's just where my head is at with all of this. And then next is the infamous Altering Cave, a place that even with this Switch re-release remains as nothing more than an orgy of Zubats, and as a monument of game devs incorporating elements into their games that go on to age like milk. For the unaware, this place was meant to house several Johto species, that would have been obtainable with some weird mystery gift shenanigans. But that never really panned out, and thus the cave houses nothing but Zubats. It's a one thing if this were still the GBA days, when stuff like this couldn't really be patched, at least not that easily, but here in the modern day, it sure would have been nice to finally have given this place its intended purpose in one way or another. Granted, a change like this may not have been possible if Pokemon wanted to maintain the original age ratings of these games, but I'm not too sure what the rules are there, so don't quote me on that. It has to do with the Game Corner, you can look it up. But bringing up the Altering Cave does bring me to the main reason why I feel so lukewarm about these islands, and why I've taken this detour talking about them when I was going on about the game's weird restrictions with its Pokédex. More than anything I just went over, I wish the Sevii Islands had more Pokemon variety. It got a little boring exploring these far off places that even have remixes of Johto tracks playing in the background when the bulk of Pokemon I'm coming across are from Kanto. It diminishes the magic of these being new locales if I'm just experiencing the same things I've already seen elsewhere in the game. And this is where the changes I propose come in. First off, just let me trade over Gen 2 and 3 Mons from the very beginning, and let me evolve my Mons into their Gen 2 evolutions. None of this saving it for the post-game nonsense. This would include lifting the restrictions to trade with Ruby and Sapphire, by the way, since this is also restricted to post-game for some stupid reason. Then, if you really are so insistent on otherwise preserving the Gen 1 experience, that you're gonna have the Kanto mainland still only be populated with Gen 1 Mons, then make it so the Sevii Islands are filled to the brim with other types of Pokemon. Instead of having just one or two Johto Pokemon here and there, some with incredibly low spawn rates, really make these islands feel like this new exciting thing. Not saying you still can't include some Kanto Mons, but change it enough to where I'm not groaning at seeing the same things over and over again. I actually wonder if Game Freak hadn't been so experimental by implementing something like Altering Cave, then perhaps the Pokemon that would have appeared there would have instead been redistributed among the islands. I'm all for cool experimentation in games, but if it's just gonna age like milk immediately upon release, then just put the fries in the bag, bro. Put the Houndour on one island. Throw in a Mareep in there too. And finally, if I'm gonna make the Sevii Islands a more notable stop on your main journey, I may as well suggest moving them up earlier into the game. As I went over earlier, you can already visit them roughly halfway into your journey if you make a beeline to Cinnabar Island and beat Blaine, but since you can still end up leaving that for the last leg of the game, then let's say that upon beating any 4 gym leaders, that triggers the Bill encounter where he invites you to the islands. They can still be optional, so if you want a more authentic OG Kanto experience, you can skip them, but if not, then there you go, halfway into the game, you get access to all these other foreign Pokemon. To me, this is the perfect compromise in appeasing those who just want to relive their Gen 1 memories, and those who may want something different. But for one reason or another, Game Freak didn't do anything like this, and what we're left with is a remake that is oddly restrictive. No, you can't use any Gen 2 Pokemon, any Gen 3 Pokemon. You're gonna play FireRed and LeafGreen with Kanto Pokemon only, and you're gonna like it. So, that's the reality I had to accept for this LeafGreen playthrough I wanted to do, right? Cause, hey, remember that was the start of me finding out about all this, to where it got me ranting about it, where any of you wondering about what I ended up doing with that playthrough? Yes? No? Well, regardless of how you responded there, I'm gonna tell you, because I promise this is gonna be more interesting than what some of you might expect to hear. If there's any one thing that has remained consistent with me in all of my years of playing Pokemon, it's my interest in breaking these games wide open. Using cheat codes to effectively have unlimited TMs back in Platinum, playing with PK Hex to get shinies and event Pokemon, more recently with PKSM with one of my modded 3DSs, And so when I heard that FireRed and LeafGreen offered a way to do this type of stuff all within the confines of the game, no external devices or third-party programs required, my ears immediately perked up and I had to know just what this was about. I'm really not like this with any other series, but when it comes to Pokemon games specifically, I don't know. There's just something about it where I want to essentially play creative mode with them. And that's exactly what ACE allows you to do in FireRed and LeafGreen. ACE being short for Arbitrary Code Execution. And to give you the layman's explanation of how this works, you essentially have the game do whatever you want by reading certain code that you input into it. The full explanation of how this works and how you set this up, I'm not gonna get into, as this really isn't that type of video, and other people have already explained this pretty well. So instead, I will have some resources linked down below in the description if you'd like to learn more about this. And hey, if you pause my video to go look into this further, I don't mind, just make sure to come back once you're done, okay? And by the way, setting this up, it's not just exclusive to the Switch version of the game. If you have an authentic GBA copy, or if you're emulating, this will also work. But why exactly would this be something you would go through the trouble of setting up? What does playing creative mode in FireRed and LeafGreen really entail? Does it really let you do the type of stuff I mentioned? Well, in my FireRed playthrough, I used ACE to clone myself a shitload of rare candies, bypassing the level grind I would have had to do right before the Elite Four, and also to turn various Pokemon, including the legendaries I caught in the post-game, into shinies. Cause frankly, as cool as it would have been to have a truly legit shiny Deoxys from this game, I'm just not gonna do that shit of soft resetting a billion times for it. But then in LeafGreen, I would yet again set up ACE, this time to unlock the National Dex early for myself, allowing me to transfer over the now shiny Larvitar and Heracross that I wanted to use, and even this Politoed and shiny Clefable. And if that wasn't enough, just to really have fun with this and exploit that I can truly do whatever I want, I spawned in a Rayquaza for me to use, cause why the hell not? But yes, thanks to the power of ACE, I was able to give the middle finger to the silly roadblocks Game Freak had decided to put up. I did have to wait a little bit for me to assemble this full squad, as setting up ACE requires the mail sold in Celadon City, but then after that, I was playing LeafGreen just how I wanted to. Look, Game Freak, I just wanted to run some Johtomons in LeafGreen, but because you had to be so stingy, you got me hacking into your game, fucking catching legendaries which shouldn't even be available here, much less in this current Switch version. It really didn't have to be this way. And these are only a few examples of what all you can do with ACE. You can also create perfect 6 IV eggs, allow any other Pokemon of your choice to spawn, reactivate encounters with legendaries, and even as of late, thanks to these games getting a boost in relevancy, someone created a script for a randomizer, something I will definitely look into for next time. And that's the cool thing that I really want to highlight with this section. Less so my experience of just saying fuck you to Game Freak, but instead how cool it is that people have messed around with FireRed and LeafGreen for all these years and figured this shit out. With Pokemon being as popular as it is, you're always gonna have people checking what's under the hood, so this isn't exclusive to just this pair of games, but for something of this caliber to be discovered and eventually be refined upon to where you can create an easy to follow guide for it, I just have to give props to the people out there working on this type of stuff. I find it fascinating that insane shit like this can be possible, things that the developers didn't intend to be part of the game. For me personally, ACE fixed my one big problem with FireRed and LeafGreen, to the point where I can kinda just disregard it for future playthroughs, with the added bonus that if I really want to, I can turn the games into a full-blown playground for me to mess around with. And if you're someone who has played these games already, maybe done so countless times and didn't intend to go back, then Ace can be that one thing that could motivate a revisit. Getting to experience something old in such a new way, I just think that's awesome. And with me saying that, what better, somewhat ironic segue into discussing why exactly Game Freak went the direction they did when they chose to remake Gen 1 in making FireRed and LeafGreen so faithful to the originals. Cause so far, I've been talking about these games through this modern day perspective, but it is equally important to go back and look at the context of when these games first came out, as it is here where we get a better understanding of Game Freak's decision making. A perfect understanding? No, as I still think they went too far in making these aggressively restrictive and could have found a better middle ground, but a better understanding nonetheless. With me refamiliarizing myself with these games, I see that Game Freak had multiple objectives with them seemingly trying to attract different audiences, each with their own wants and needs. First, there's the issue of Ruby and Sapphire not being able to connect to the Gen 1 and 2 games. For people who have stuck around with the franchise, now picked up Ruby and Sapphire, they were currently locked out of completing the National Pokédex, as they couldn't transfer up their older mons that weren't able to be caught in Hoenn. A game needed to come in to fill in those gaps, like say a Kanto remake. But since the GBA is already backwards compatible with Game Boy and Game Boy Color cartridges, would players really want to repurchase a game they can effectively still play with modern hardware just to complete their Pokédex? A game which, by the way, already had multiple re-releases? Shouldn't we further entice them by making this more of a new experience? That's one argument in making these remakes less faithful to the originals. But then, there's the issue that Pokemon's relevancy is starting to slip away. Ruby and Sapphire sold well, but less than Gen 2, which already sold less than Gen 1. It's hard for me to believe this, since I got into Pokemon when the brand had already solidified itself as a mainstay, but back in Gen 3, there was doubt in the air in how much longer this would last. So what do you do to attract players that may have left the franchise? You remake their childhood experiences because nostalgia always sells. And what better way to sell them on these new games if you just say that this is exactly what they remembered, but better. Play it safe, get some easy money, fair enough. That's one point in making these more faithful. And finally, there's the third crowd of people, those who had never even played a Pokemon game. Features like the Teachy TV, a key item just for tutorials, pressing the triggers to open up more information, the little recap the game does each time you boot it up, these were all added in service of newer players. But if you're a newer player and you hear that these new games are easier or can better accommodate you, what do you care if the games are faithful or not so faithful to Gen 1? Those games are irrelevant to you. You have no point of reference. So that's one point towards, well, neither camp. So we now have a situation where Game Freak is being pulled by two sides equally, where they could go in either direction. That is, if I continue to frame this situation in this fashion, as there were two more factors here. Unfortunately, I cannot find a hard source on this, but from everything I've seen online, these games had an incredibly short development cycle of 1, maybe 2 years. To add credence to this limited development time, FireRed and LeafGreen and Emerald were only released several months apart. So even if development were on the longer end of this estimate, Game Freak still had their attention split by another game coming out within the same release window. Combine that with Game Freak's acknowledgement of the older games benefiting from a potential facelift, it was clear what direction they would take from the moment they decided they would make this game. Hey, we're short on time, we need a game that needs to address all these issues, we shall make a faithful Gen 1 remake. By doing so, we save on development time, not worrying about changing too much, we give Gen 1 an improvement that it could use, We don't alienate fans that just want to re-experience their childhood. Newer fans won't mind either way, and for those that stuck around with us, well, they get the Sevii Islands as this new bonus, plus they still get to enjoy all the modern improvements that will come with this remakes, so hopefully they don't complain too much. Though, really, it seems Game Freak were doing their best trying to market these as totally new games, touting features like the new wireless connectivity as something that will make FireRed and LeafGreen stand out from its original counterparts. While I read this as marketing speak to maybe dodge the fact that these games would still be quite similar, I can at least hand this feature some credit, as FireRed and LeafGreen acted as the first testing ground for what Diamond and Pearl, and by extension the DS, would go on to offer. Wireless features aside, are the other modern improvements and features enough to qualify this as a new game? That's for you to answer yourself. What I will say is that no matter where you stand on this, at least we can all agree that Gen 1 did benefit a lot from this remake. Right? Cause that's what Kanto was known for. They were buggy games with all these glitches, certain mechanics just didn't work as intended, they were limited to what was already old hardware at the time of the Game Boy, but now all of that has been patched up. And they benefit from this revisit 2 generations later, now including all these added features that would be introduced after Gen 1. Held items, natures, and abilities make battles more dynamic. Running shoes, easier to manage boxes, a larger, more organized bag, all of these are much appreciated quality of life changes. Friendship and breeding adds to the experience of interacting with your Pokemon. You have an option for a female protagonist, which was the new standard. You have shiny Pokemon, and of course you get the updated graphics and sounds. Though, I do like some of the older songs more, like the original Lavender Town theme. However, oddly enough, these games lack an internal battery for a day and night cycle, a feature which also seemed to be a new standard going into these games. So you can't evolve Eevee into Espeon or Umbreon even in the post-game, which I just find to be a weird random exclusion. I don't know what's up with that. At least, they gave us the newly introduced Versus Seeker, which is a great addition as it makes grinding levels easier. Granted, I didn't really use it here due to me spawning rare candies with Ace, but back in Platinum, I totally abused the hell out of this thing, so I can confirm its usefulness. But with all these improvements, surely that justifies the existence of FireRed and LeafGreen by making them the definitive way to play through Kanto. It's gotta be better than going back and playing those old, stinky Game Boy games. Ew, a game with no color on the fucking Game Boy? That shit don't even got a backlight. I can't play that. Gross. Surprise! This video also serves as a Pokemon Red and Blue review. Originally, this was just meant to be a video on FireRed and LeafGreen, but I felt like this would be incomplete if I didn't also play through Gen 1. And funnily enough, my experience with Pokemon Red and Blue mirrors my experience with the remakes. Exactly 10 years ago, I had only played through Blue for a few hours before never coming back to it until making this video. Luckily, this situation doesn't involve any decisions I immensely regret. Rather, what happened is that for Pokemon's 20th anniversary, they released this limited edition new 3DS that came preloaded with Red and Blue. And I played through Blue for a bit, beating the first 3 gyms, but I eventually stopped, admittedly due to me lacking some of the patience required to get through the game. No running shoes kinda sucked, limited bag space was annoying to take into account, boxes weren't as easy to manage. I really wasn't having that great of a time. In fact, I was kinda just playing them as a novelty, out of curiosity to see firsthand how this series I love started. and not because I had a genuine interest in seeing this through to the very end. But that was 10 years ago. I've since matured in many ways, and one of those ways is me being more open-minded about playing older games. And you know what? This time around, I had so much fun with Pokemon Blue. Over the course of, I want to say 4 or 5 days, I blasted through this game from Vermilion City to me capturing Mewtwo at Cerulean Cave. I could not put this game down. It brought me immense joy playing it. So what happened for me to have such a drastic 180 with these games? Games I had always viewed as outdated, that would go on to benefit from much needed quality of life improvements. Games that today only stand out due to their cultural impact, and not because of their actual quality. Well, the first thing is I stopped caring so much about those previous annoyances. Like sure, it still would have been nice to have running shoes, as it would have made things like going through Silphco easier, but this is not a make it or break it feature. Plus, it's not like it takes very long to unlock the bike. The existence of this one item kinda just shuts down the need for me to complain about this. Meanwhile, my issue with the limited bag space, I just had to change my perspective and pretend like I was playing a survival horror game. Right before this, I had just finished playing through Resident Evil 9, so this skill of smart inventory management was extremely fresh in my mind. I was frequently going back to the PC and depositing items and key items I knew I wouldn't need. And if I did hit my bag's limit, I would oftentimes have something I could use or afford to throw away to pick up whatever it is I want to get. As for the boxes, I also got used to them pretty quickly. The worst part about them was just me finding out that if your currently selected box is full, and if your party is also full, you're unable to catch any more Pokemon. So I had to be keeping track of that to make sure I always had available box space. Other weird quirks about Gen 1, like moves randomly missing when they shouldn't, psychic types being overpowered, the existence of a singular special stat, crits being based on speed, the trainer AI being god-awful, Ultra Balls not universally being the best widely available ball to use, or moves like Bind locking you in for several turns, killing the pace of battles. These were all mild annoyances at worst. Issues that did need to be addressed, and I am glad have all been fixed for the most part, but it's not like these are hard games to begin with, where things like this would be all that impactful. On the flip side, if the game was gonna play by these archaic rules, then so will I. I'm gonna make full use of these older mechanics. For the first time ever in one of my in-game teams, I ran a Stallmon with Tangela, teaching it Bind and Toxic to slowly kill trapped targets. My Gyarados had Hyper Beam, because of course you gotta teach Gyarados Hyper Beam, and it was damn satisfying not having to recharge every time I KO'd a Pokemon. Articuno ran Blizzard, because for whatever reason, Game Freak thought it was a good idea to have a straight upgrade to Ice Beam with this 120 base power move with no drawback outside of its still solid 90% accuracy. A lesson they have since learned, of course. It is a fact that Gen 1 needed many improvements. It's why the original Red and Green got 2 do-overs with Pokemon Blue and then Pokemon Yellow. And even then, those left a lot of things unaddressed, instead saving those fixes for Gen 2 and beyond. But as messy as these games may be, they did get one thing right. Something I now only realize having experienced this myself. Red and Blue knocked it out of the park with what makes up the core Pokemon experience that we now all know and love. Even with all the modern day features and improvements stripped away, Pokemon in this pure, raw, kinda janky form is still a lot of fun. Going around, catching cool creatures that you like, building your team, seeing them grow stronger and evolve, even in this primitive state, is something that holds up to this day. Proof of this is how giddy I was when building my team for this playthrough. Another first for me was deciding to run a theme team with all of my members being blue for Pokemon Blue. Dabba-dee-dabba-doo. You can't tell me with the footage, but trust me, these are all blue Pokemon. I opened up Pokemon Showdown, looked through my potential options, decided who would make the cut, and then slowly but surely, it was exciting getting to each member. Finding a Moonstone early on, and thus already having access to a good Stage 3 Pokemon in the early game with Nidoqueen, evolving Magikarp into Gyarados, which is always immensely satisfying. Unlocking Surf as fast as possible to head to the patch of grass below Pallet Town to catch Tangela. Going through the maze that is Silphco for the free Lapras, and then making it through the Seafoam Islands to be rewarded with the legendary Articuno. Finally seeing my squad of 6 fully assembled, it was a great feeling. The same one I've gotten with every other Pokemon game I have played. And to further add to this childhood glee I get with every Pokemon game, I need to talk about the glitches. Because just like with FireRed and LeafGreen, I had to mess around with the available exploits. Something I learned whilst playing through this is that if you go into the Safari Zone, immediately leave, fly to Cinnabar Island, and surf along the coast, you can catch the Safari Zone Pokemon here rather than dealing with the headache that is the Safari game. If I cared about completing the Pokédex here, I would have absolutely continued to abuse the hell out of this. But that is nothing compared to the big daddy of glitches himself, arguably the most famous one in all of gaming, Missing No. You know, Articuno, Zapdos, Moltres, Mewtwo, and Mew, these are all legendary Pokemon. Okay, I know Mew is technically a mythical, but still legendary to me, damn it. But I'm already plenty familiar with them. Caught them in multiple games, nothing new for me at this point. But Missing No, finally encountering this thing in my very own playthrough of Pokemon Blue, having known about it ever since I got into the franchise. This truly felt legendary. The shit-eating grin I had seeing this fucked up amalgamation of code on my screen, triggering it as easy as I did with the seemingly random steps required, using it to clone my Master Ball, rare candies, all of my good TMs, even using it to catch a level 100 Porygon. The same thing that I said about Ace applies here. I get a lot of enjoyment finding ways to exploit these games. And it is on this note about glitches that I want to wrap up my thoughts on Red and Blue for this section. Are these games filled to the brim with bugs, glitches, programming errors? Yes, they absolutely are. Poison may be the most common type in Gen 1, but really it's the bug type. Ha ha ha. But do these get in the way of your playing experience? Not really. Unless you go out of your way to find them, or are unlucky enough to trap yourself in a niche softlock, your playthrough of Gen 1 will run just fine. If anything, these glitches add to the experience, like with the two I mentioned, or with other famous ones like the Mew glitch, where through a specific set of steps, you can catch yourself a Mew within the game, no special limited time distribution event required. At this point, I've been a fan of this franchise for 17 years, but it is only now where I can say that I truly get it. Pokemon Red and Blue, they get my respect. If I could have this amount of fun with them in this modern day, I can't even imagine how it must have felt back then. I can say with full confidence, these are fun games that do hold up. You do have to adjust your mindset a bit, but if you're a fan of this franchise and have yet to play them, I implore you do so because I think you will appreciate them much like I did. To bring FireRed and LeafGreen back into this discussion, there's one question I now want to answer that you might be wondering. Is there a version that I prefer? And I'm not gonna lie to you here, or even to myself, but I have to say that I might like Gen 1 more. And my thought process here is simple. Yes, FireRed and LeafGreen are on paper the better versions. They fixed a lot that was wrong with Gen 1. They have more content. they have quality of life features that make the overall experience smoother. But in this modern day, they are now also older games. Games that themselves lack even more modern quality of life features. No XP share, repels that don't automatically ask you to use another one, single-use TMs, HMs are still a thing. Granted, they are pretty minimal in the Kanto games, which I will actually mark as a positive compared to something like Gen 4 where it got excessive. There's no shiny charm or anything like the Masuda method to make shiny hunting easier. No physical special split. You get it. The list goes on. I can kinda just view both of these as older games with things I'm gonna have to put up with. So from that angle, is there any one single X factor that tips the scales in one direction? Well, one major criticism that pops to mind I've yet to mention are the crappy movesets for most Pokemon that are heavily reliant on single-use TMs. This would be my biggest complaint with Gen 1, except that this issue persists with the remakes. It's not until Gen 4 and 5 that this series-wide issue was addressed, so I can't really use this for my argument. Rather, I have to yet again mention my big complaint with FireRed and LeafGreen, which would be their restrictiveness. At the end of the day, I have two games in front of me, both of which I enjoyed, both of which show their age, except one has this extra big thing that really annoys me, while the other one doesn't. I'm not saying Gen 1 is better than FireRed and LeafGreen, but if I ever want to play through Kanto again, that's something I'll have to think about rather than it being a decision I automatically decide on by saying I'll play through the remakes, because they both have their own upsides that make them worth playing. Before I close this out, I do have a few more things I would be remiss if I didn't bring up. Like, Game Freak's decision to make FireRed and LeafGreen faithful remakes. We went over why they did this and how I feel about it, but did the sales numbers go on to justify this decision? Well, they kinda didn't. Don't get me wrong, FireRed and LeafGreen sold well. It is a mainline Pokemon game after all, but it did sell less than Ruby and Sapphire. In fact, they were the worst selling paired releases in the series at that point. Looking at current day numbers, it doesn't quite look that way, but we can thank the Switch re-release for that. And I have reason to believe that Game Freak took this data to heart. Pokemon fans want something new with their games. When it came time to remake Gen 2 and Gen 3, the remakes they got felt like so much more than just straight upgrades, rather serving as more of a newer experience using the originals as a template. Well, I can't really say that about Gen 2, as I've yet to play through Gold, Silver, or Crystal, but with Gen 3, as someone who has played both Emerald and Omega Ruby, these are absolutely two different games, way more distinct from one another than Gen 1 and its remakes. Even when it came time to remake Gen 4, yeah, we got BDSP as another super faithful remake, but Pokemon took that into account and released Legends Arceus just a few months later, yet again providing something new for fans. It is worth acknowledging that even with this direction, remakes have continued to sell worse than the games that kickstart the generation, but I'm still glad Game Freak has stuck with this direction, as I would rather take something different on a familiar formula than a plain remake that just serves as an improved version when it comes to Pokemon. That's an important distinction I want to make, because originally this video was going to feature a pretty lengthy discussion going over game remakes in general. Something spurred by me playing Resident Evil 4 Remake earlier this year, Silent Hill 1 late last year, and me now playing FireRed and LeafGreen, which are obviously also remakes, with this segment being a part of that. However, I decided it would be best if I cut out the rest of this discussion and instead save it for its own dedicated video. It would have hit on this topic of how faithful remakes should be, among other talking points, like when are remakes even necessary, and are remakes potentially harmful and that they replaced the original material. It was just gonna be way too much for this one single video. As for when I plan to release this, I don't know, don't ask me. I do have an idea as to when I might put it out, but it'll be out when I feel it's ready to be put out, okay? The penultimate talking point I will bring up for today is the little kerfuffle that happened once it was announced that FireRed and LeafGreen's re-release would be priced at $20 each. You get the whole crowd of people who will complain about how this should have been cheaper, or how, well, you know you can just emulate this for free. I want to throw in what I think about all this. In regards to the price, should it have been cheaper? Yeah, I think 10 bucks would have been perfect. But at the currently priced 20 bucks each, it's still pretty cheap, and I knew I was still gonna get my money's worth, so I wasn't complaining. As for the whole just emulate crowd, unfortunately, something you guys need to realize is that people are lazy. What's the saying? You can lead a horse to water, but you can't force it to drink. For a lot of people, they would rather just open up their Switch, press a few buttons to play their old childhood game, than go through some process of downloading things on their phone, PC, or console, as simple as it may be. Speaking as someone who has always been in favor of emulation while only recently getting into it, I can appreciate spreading awareness that there are dubiously legal methods of playing games you might want to check out, but for a lot of us, we'll still prefer an official re-release for one reason or another. And at the end of the day, re-releases like this should always be championed. Not saying that we can't criticize them if we feel the need to do so. Like, as another recent example, I find the Mario Galaxy pack of $70 pretty fucking egregious. But once I stop shaking my fist at Nintendo, then I can take some solace knowing there are more people playing these great games. It was a great thing seeing my feed full of posts of people playing FireRed and LeafGreen for the first time or revisiting them, as we all partook in this one shared experience. Plus, it drives more discussion of the games, it gets more people looking into them, as previously mentioned. It's always gonna be a great thing having more games be more widely accessible. I myself am incredibly grateful this re-release happened. It's because of it, and by extension Red and Blue, that for the first time ever, I can call myself a genuine Kanto fan. More than I already was, as I have always had a fondness for the classic anime, the TCG, the manga, and as I went over a good chunk of the decks. I will never be a Gen 1er, a Gen 4 and 5 hold that place in my heart, but it does feel nice to have a broader appreciation of this series that means so much to me. That is the mark of a successful game. So much so that now, after playing through the remakes twice, the original version, and now I want to play through Yellow, but on original hardware. I may have been dismissive of Red and Blue earlier, but Yellow was always the version I was willing to maybe play through someday. And now, I have been playing through it on this beautiful Game Boy Color model that I recently picked up and have always wanted to own. Like, honestly, this has always been one of my favorite limited edition consoles, and now that I have it, I'm gonna be playing through some older games in authentic fashion. But regardless of how you choose to play through Kanto, whatever version or hardware you go with, I think you'll have a great time. There will be some shit you have to put up with, but as I've already taught you, if it really bothers you that much, don't worry. The games still offer some sort of solution. Oh, but Zeke, does this include Let's Go? Is that being recommended here as well? And, kinda, I guess. I still don't care for those games all that much. Good art direction though, that I will praise. Anyway, final words. The Kanto games, they may not be as elaborate or as flashy as future entries, but they are the bedrock that Pokemon has used to build an entire empire on. And that shit is about as rock solid as it gets. To think there was any doubt this would last beyond just a few years. Pokemon, good job on turning 30. Let's hope for many more. Thanks for watching.